And then I'm also gonna start streaming. Yes. And it'll take like 20 seconds or so. Like I say, testing. This to start. And I'm just gonna wait for it to start so that there's not this audio feedback that always seems to happen. Like I say, test. Okay, awesome. All right.
Perfect.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the second colloquium of the year. I am recording and streaming right now. We are delighted to have Jhonnatan Rangel with us here, and Professor Kate Lindsay will be introducing him.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to be introducing Jhonnatan Rangel as today's colloquium speaker as part of our Emerging Scholars series. Jhonnatan is a very talented linguist. His dissertation focused on the documentation and description of a language called Ayapaneco, which is spoken in southern Mexico. And from what I read online, Ayapaneco is famous for bringing the word cocoa to the world. Is that true, Jhonnatan? And Ayapaneco was also the subject of a very controversial marketing stunt by Vodafone. What makes Jhonnatan's dissertation work really unique, I think, is that in his description of the language, he doesn't shy away from the rampant variation in the language as spoken by the speakers. I think that many grammarians, field workers, people who document or describe languages often choose an analytical approach that casts variation as kind of an exception to the rule. And there's this deep kind of quest or search for what is it that is common, what is it that is underlying, and that this type of like this abstract system of what language is somehow doesn't have any variation in it. And I think that instead what Jhonnatan did is that he made the linguistic variation of this language, not just did he include it in his description, but he really made it the main focus of his dissertation. And he offers a multifactorial analysis to explain that variation, which I think is a very bold and very admirable move on his part. And I think we're going to be hearing a little bit more about that today. But besides this linguistic work, Jhonnatan has also worked hard to promote collaboration between academia and language communities. And he's also advocated for scholars of color and other minoritized groups that are working in linguistics. He's the founding member of a group called Scholars of Color in Language Studies, which is dedicated to providing a platform for voices of minorities who have historically been underrepresented in academia. I personally find Jhonnatan to be very inspiring, and I'm looking forward to hearing his talk today. So let's give our speaker a very warm welcome with our applause emojis. And thank you so much, Jhonnatan, for joining us today.
Thank you all. Thank you all for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to try to share with you how I understand variation and how I understand different aspects of language description and documentation. And actually, I will be a little bit more precise what you say, Kate. That is exactly, it's correct. But instead of saying that I incorporated variation into description, I will say that I incorporated description into variation. So it's more that actually the case that I did it the opposite direction. So just because that's exactly the whole point of what I'm trying to present today. So, well, let me share my screen here with my presentation here. Let me see. Okay, there you go. Okay, so to start with, well, I mean, I'm going to talk about documenting variation in critically endangered languages, and that's the whole point of what I've been doing over the last years, working with specifically one critically endangered language spoken in Mexico, and well, this is the agenda. This is what we're gonna try to talk about critically endangered languages in general, to actually be more precise what I'm talking about, what I refer to critically endangered language, so we all understand what kind of the spectrum of language endangerment I'm talking about Ayapaneco, which is this one of this critically endangered languages spoken in Mexico, about documentation variation, and then I'm just gonna go with one main or general conclusion for this presentation. So before everything, I think that the title of my presentation comes from a quote from one of the speakers of this language that he told me once. He told me something like words like the wind. As soon as you feel them, they disappear, and later you don't know what happened. For those who speak Spanish, the actual quote was something like, la lengua es como el aire, que enseguida lo sientes y no sabes, pero así es la lengua, así se va la palabra, something like that. And that quote actually, it's a very powerful quote that actually, when we were talking about language endangerment and how he understood language endangerment, and then months after he told me that, I remember that I put it into my field notes, and I said this is a very, very good way to summarize language endangerment. But at the same time, what he was talking, it was how the words, actually the language itself, is like when you feel it, you know that it's there, and the language is there, the words are like that, but at the same time, they disappear, is something ephemeral. And that's what he was talking, what he was referring when he told me this exactly in 2020. So I thought that it was a very good way to actually define both language endangerment and also linguistic variation. And in this presentation, I'm gonna try to explain to you why his quote, or how this quote is so pertinent to when you study variation in critically endangered languages. So let's start with the basic situation here. What's a critically endangered languages? I'm not gonna give a definition, but I'm just gonna explain some main characteristics these languages have. One of them, one of the characteristics of critically endangered languages are those who have the traditional or intergenerational transmission of the language interrupted for decades. You can have other languages that are in danger and they have no kids or not children speaking the language, but you still have young adults that speak the language. In this case, critically endangered languages, we're talking about intergenerational transmission that stop decades, not only like a couple of years or even a decade, but for decades. That has a direct result on the age of the speakers, and usually the youngest speakers of these languages are grandparents or great grandparents. We're talking about languages spoken by elders mostly. In some cases, there could be a few younger members of the community that speak the language, but usually a language is spoken by elders. Also, another characteristics of these languages is they usually have a very small proportion in speaker to relation to the larger community. So this is a more demographic kind of characteristic, that is a very reduced number of people that actually use the language or speak the language in relation to the community itself, the larger community. So there's a very small proportion. And also, there's a very sporadic use of the language. There's a very sporadic use of the language. And when it's used, it's usually used in very few private domains. These languages are not longer used in public domains for different reasons that maybe we can talk about, but they're usually already used to very few private domains when they use at all. And usually there's a correlation with lack or limited literacy in the language. That doesn't mean that the speakers themselves of these languages, they're not literate or they cannot read or write, but when they do it in a majority language. In this case, it could be a colonial language, in this case, like a Spanish or English or French or so on. So basically, literacy in these languages is very limited. In some cases, it never existed also. So that's what we're talking about, this main characteristics of critically endangered languages. So critically endangered languages, we can say, that are minority and minorized languages are spoken by marginalized communities. That's something important to say. So as such, we can say that it's minority languages spoken by minorities, because it's a very small group, as we said, a very small group of people speaking the languages. Minorized languages, because the languages are overwhelmingly minorized, but as I said, colonial language or majority language or other kind of languages. In this case will be Spanish, but it could be any other language. And usually that's correlates with marginalized communities, or actually communities of people living in poverty, extreme poverty, and different circumstances. So basically, this is the full the what we can say about critically endangered language, how this interaction between the state of the language endangerment and something that is nothing to do with linguistic, but with extreme social factors that actually correlate with these critically endangered languages. So this is not an isolated, this kind of languages in the world is not a very small proportion of language. Actually represents, before COVID, it used to represent 10% of the worst languages that are critically endangered. They could disappear any time this decade. This is important to mention it because contrary or different to the other kind of language endangerment or other languages that are endangered, they still have different generations speaking the language, or at least young adults speaking the language. At least the language could continue for the next 50, 60 years. In this case, if the current dynamics don't change, it's probably that this language disappeared by 2030. That's one of the facts that these languages have. So in the world, it's about 10% of the world languages share the same characteristics. So this is something important to mention. This is not an isolated phenomenon from one region of the world or other region of the world, but this is a global phenomenon. Every single dot that you see here represents one critically endangered languages. So you can see that are spread out around the entire world. There's no single place that is safe from this phenomenon. So we can find them pretty much everywhere in the world. So it's a phenomenon that it's widespread from different regions, different kind of like economic situation and context, but overall you can find it everywhere, a little bit everywhere in the world. So that's something to keep in mind when we're talking about this. So I'm gonna talk specifically my experience working with one of these red dots, actually that is one in Mexico. There are several of those in Mexico as well, as you can say in North America and US too. But I'm gonna try to link my experience working with one of these languages and in one of these communities, and what happens with critically endangered languages related to variation. So one of these languages, as Kate said, is Ayapaneco, which is one of the indigenous languages spoken in Mexico. One of the many languages, indigenous languages spoken in Mexico. We can see here some images about a typical. It's a very tropical place with a rainy season and a dry season. And well, what she was referring, Kate, is the cocoa beans there in the right bottom. And yes, actually they use it for pre-Hispanic kind of beverage before chocolate even existed. And yeah, it's a very tropical, humid place and very flat. There's no mountains around. And you can see the beautiful church, the main church of the village, Ayapa, that they change the color of the church every 5 to 6 years. So it's very interesting to keep photos every time that you go because they're might change it. And it's very interesting to see the patterns that they use for painting the church. So this is Ayapaneco. Ayapaneco is a language from the Mixtezoque language family. In Mexico, there's about 11 families of languages. One of them is the Mixtezoque language family. And this family, the language of this family is spoken around Veracruz, Oaxaca, Chiapas, and Tabasco. That's in the south of Mexico, along the Gulf of Mexico. Ayapa or Ayapazoque, Ayapaneco, it's spoken, as you can see there, in Tabasco, very nearby the Gulf of Mexico. It's about 45 minutes from Ayapa that you can reach the coast. And these languages are traditionally spoken along the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is that line that goes from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. And yeah, these languages, I divided in two main branches, the Mixe branch and the Zoque branch. The Zoque branch is Ayapaneco belongs to this branch, and the other languages, well, you have a little bit of everything in terms of Zoque or Mixe branch. So Ayapaneco is not the language, is not the name of the language in Ayapaneco. So we have an autonym or a way that they talk or they actually call their language. They call it num deode, actually something like num deode, num diode, num diode, num diode. There's different ways to say, speaking of variation, but let's agree for the sake of simplicity right now that it's called num deode. And that means basically true voice, true speech, or true language. So for them, num deode, it's the real language. Ayapaneco is the real language. The other language are not languages or not the real languages. So that's how the speakers themselves call the language. However, also the speakers sometimes they call it Ayapaneco, and it's simple to call it Ayapaneco because it's the only language spoken in this community that is not Spanish. So when you say Ayapaneco, you know that that's the only language that could be referred to as Ayapaneco. However, the autonym is the correct autonym is Numdeode, which is true language. So Ayapaneco, it's spoken in Ayapa, as I said, hence the name Ayapaneco. And it's a community of about 5,500 inhabitants. It's not a very, very small community, but it's a medium-sized community, I would say. Speakers, there are approximately 8 remaining elder speakers and a younger heritage speaker, and it's uh, it's almost 0.2% of the total population of Ayapa. So when I was saying one of the characteristics of critical endangered languages is that it's a very small proportion of speakers in relation to the larger community, because this is what I was talking about. It's not 10%, 20%, but it's extremely low. And 32% of the total population is very low for in this case, for this language. And it's approximately these 8 remaining elder speakers. The transmission of the language was interrupted for over 60 years. So that explains the age of the speakers, the elder speakers. So that explains why you just have pretty much elder speakers speaking the language right now. It was interrupted due to different reasons and different factors. It's a multifactorial there are multiple factors that came into this, but the language hasn't been transmitted over more than 60 years. The language was rarely used in daily life. The speakers themselves are bilingual, and I'm going to talk more about the speakers later on. But they're bilinguals. All of them, they acquire Ayapaneco as the first language, and then they acquire Spanish as a second language when they started to go to school when they were 5 or 6 years older. And they're all bilingual right now. So basically, in their daily life, they use mostly Spanish because their family members, they don't speak the language, and the neighbors, they don't speak the language. So, and since there are so few of them, few speakers, then actually they do the daily life in Spanish because they're fluent in Spanish as well. So it's a language that are very, very rarely used in daily life. And all the interactions among the local population, if you don't count the speakers of Ayapaneco themselves in this community, all the interactions among them are conducted in Spanish. Spanish, as many of you may know, is not an official language in Mexico. Mexico doesn't have an official language, but it's a language that actually by default is official because it's the language of education, economic, etc. While the other indigenous languages have the same status. Actually, legally, all the indigenous languages together with Spanish have the same legal status in Mexico so far. But in reality, we know that doesn't happen. The proof is that there's a lot of languages that suffer from the same similar conditions that Ayapaneco. So all the interactions among the local population are conducted in Spanish. This was a language that happens to be previously under-documented and under-described. So added to the list of complexity that this language had is that we didn't have a very a lot of information about the language. It was some linguists back in the 70s discovered the language or found the language, and then after that we didn't have much information. We have a couple of linguistic sources in the 90s and then in the 2000s, but we didn't have a full description or even a documentation that it is useful for other kind of work. So, and the language was never written. So we developed the first writing system in 2019. Before that, all the speakers in the community would use Spanish just for writing or doing everything for literacy activities. And some speakers at some point in their life, they write something in Ayapaneco, but without any proper system, and they just like isolated people trying to write the language here and there, but we didn't have historical writers or historical documents written in the language. So we started to develop that with the group of the community, with some speakers and some members of the community, and hopefully to start producing some text in the language for the community. This is where I'm talking about writing system for the community, not for linguists or for external people. So to summarize this, we can say that Ayapanecos is an indigenous language, it's a minority language too, and it's a minorized language spoken mainly by elders in a context of marginalization. So it's already say minority in terms of numbers, minorized. Spanish really puts a lot of pressure on the language, like many other indigenous languages in Mexico, mainly spoken by elders in this context of marginalization. Also in Ayapa, in this community, there's a lot of poverty and a lot of problems of access to healthcare and clean water and pollution and so on. So the elders, together with the entire community, live in a context of marginalization. So this is the context of this language. So if the situation continues like this language could disappear in the next 5 to 10 years. So that therefore I say that it's a critically endangered language. So if the situation or the context doesn't change, the language can go could disappear in the next 5 to 10 years for sure. That's one of the things that is happening right now in Ayapaneco. So this is a very brief summary of Ayapaneco to give you just an idea what I'm talking about when I say that critically endangered languages, and also why Ayapaneco is one of those languages that makes up the 10% of the endangered languages of the world. So the question that we might ask ourselves is, okay, if it's an undescribed, underdocumented languages, why don't we document or describe the language first? And I think that it's a very, it's a question that we all probably we will say that, yes, that actually makes sense. And for me too, I would say that, well, that makes sense. Now, it's not as simple as we can think. I mean, the idea could be, okay, let's try to document first the language, then describe it. And then once we have a proper documentation, a proper description, then we attack and we try to work on variation. But actually, there's something that we need to consider when we talk about variation, is that when we recognize variation, that implies that we must recognize language is not just some kind of abstract object study. It's also something that people use. And variation happens to be something that people use, whether we like it as linguists or whether we can deal with it as researchers or not. That happens with or without us. So in general, for every language, that's a reality. But when you get to critically endangered languages, the situation gets a little bit more tricky and complicated. So why to study variation in a critically endangered language to start is because it's something that is part of the language and we cannot isolate it from the language. And that's also something that the speakers themselves and the community themselves actually use. So by trying to put it off for later or not to actually properly trying to address it, we are losing a lot of information of the language, the community itself, and a lot of information that actually could be very useful. So how you study variation? Well, there's different ways to study variation, but one of them is we already know about those are familiar. Some students that are here from masters or PhD, probably they come across the variation is a hypothesis that started with William Labo studying African American vernacular English, and it's what actually a lot of the variationist studies actually kick off back in the 70s. And the hypothesis that this variationist hypothesis has is that variation follows the principle of orderly or heterogeneity. What is this orderly heterogeneity principle? What basically means that variation, it could be linguistically patterned. What's linguistically patterned variation? It's the variation that is intralinguistic. That's variation that it's within the language itself. So that would be the grammar rules, some grammar rules or linguistic factors inside of the language. That doesn't have to do anything with external factors of the language. And then variation also can be socially patterned. And socially patterned is extra linguistic. So this principle actually it tells us that variation, no matter how much varies and how heterogeneous is, it happens to be structured around two fundamental patterns, linguistically and social patterns. So with this in mind, we can say that if you have to approach language variation in any way, you can either decide to study variation or document variation in a linguistic pattern or the social pattern. So to give you an example of orderly heterogeneity principles. So if it's a linguistically pattern structure variation, you have for instance, in Spanish, we have the definite article, el, la, los, las, which is basically a definite article that is conditioned by the gender, feminine, masculine, and plural and singular. So this is the kind of variation that would appear in a grammar description in Spanish if you will happen to work with variation in Spanish in the linguistically pattern kind of variation. And that's what most of linguists that work in description do. Actually, when you describe the language, you're trying to find these patterns and these grammar rules to actually help you to understand when to various and these morphemes that appear with this in this context or in this other context, and you can actually infer a rule of that. So that will be the linguistic pattern. Then you have the social pattern or the socially pattern kind of variation. It is variation that is not linked to the language itself, but actually the context or social context. It could be different factors for social context. Let's put an example here. You say vacation in US, but you say holiday if you're from UK. And this, whether you use vacation or holiday, that would depend in the social context, not in the language itself. So you're a social linguist, you're going to be interested in socially pattern variation. And if you're a descriptivist, probably you're going to be more interested in linguistically pattern but variation. So the fundamental problem with that is this works fine for different kind of studies of language. I'm going to give some examples, but usually when you work in languages such as Ayapaneco, there's not a tradition working in a variationist approach or sociolinguistic approach in critically endangered languages like Ayapaneco that are previously underdocumented. So basically, the subfield or subdomain of linguistics that deals with this kind of language is documentary linguistics. Documentary linguistics actually focus on underdocumented languages and not necessarily in other aspects of language. So the variationist approach deals or focus on documented languages. So as I was putting the example of the Spanish or English, there are languages that we know more or less how they work. We have documentation, we have several descriptions, and that's when the variationist approach can be used, and you can actually infer different kind of variables in the language that are not necessarily linked to linguistic variables itself, but probably social variables. But in the case of Ayapaneco, or mostly documentary linguistic objects of study, they're under documented, so you don't have that variationist approach usually deals with. So the linguistic focus really changes depending on what approach you use. If you come from the variationist approach, you actually have a narrow linguistic focus. By a narrow linguistic focus, I mean that you are interested in a particular construction or a particular morpheme or a particular sound of the language, a particular context that you're interested in, and you study that and how it varies. It could be by different social factors. While in documentary linguistics, actually doesn't care much about one specific factor, but actually try to get as much as the language as you can, because it's underdocumented. It usually is a language that is in danger in some respect. So if you see the two different kind of focuses are completely different from one another, and you go for the sample, actually the variationist approach usually deals with a big sample, and documentary approach, it actually deals with a very small sample. A big sample is with a lot of speakers. Usually the variationist approach, you have a lot of data that you can actually run some statistically meaningful data or tests, while in documentary linguistics, sometimes you don't have that option to do statistics because you work with a very, very small sample of data. And that's another fundamental difference between these two approaches. And finally, one of these different approaches, or one of these main differences between documentary linguistics and variationist approach, is the context. Usually, most studies, or traditionally, the variationist approach developed in the context of weird societies. By weird societies, I mean Western educated, industrialized, and rich democratic. And the whole social variables that were used for studying this variation in these languages were developed during this context of weird societies, while documentary linguistics actually focus a little bit more on non-weird societies, such as the case of Ayapaneco, or for example, a language in Amazonias, in Brazil, Piraha, for instance, or other language that actually they don't have the same context. It's not as a non-weird context, let's put it that way. So if you see there are two approaches that you can say, okay, I want to document a Ayapaneco or a Creek endangered language, so I go under documentary linguistics approach. But if I want to study variation, I use the variationist approach. But the question here is, what happens if you want to document variation in an indigenous, minority, minorized, critically endangered, and underdocumented language as spoken a predominantly norm context? A norm context is another tag that we can use, but it's for usually refers to non-mobile older rural males. This tag usually was used during the dialectology studies back in the 80s and 70s, and it was just people that I was born and raised in these communities, mostly males, and the people that used to do dialectology studies actually gather data from this norm people, because it was used to see it was the most pure form, or actually to compare with other dialect from other norm people in other community, and so like that you can make difference, you can actually check or study the difference between these two communities, how they used to speak or how they speak. But in the case of Ayapaneco, it's true, because I'm going to talk about it later on, but I've been working with out of the 80 speakers, and the speakers that I've been working, I worked with 4 of them for my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, and all of them were non-mobile old rural males. They were, or elders that were happened to be males. And so, as I said, I mean, it's not the question is how you go ahead and kind of document variation in this context, when actually the literature, the methodological, theoretical, everything that you have at your disposal for study variation was developed during the in the context of a weird society, and in a context that actually is very different what you want to study. That's one of the main problems. So this brings me to my next the next part, that is that this, in order to do so, you have to face some theoretical methodological blind spot. So this blind spots. One of them is the limited language documentation and description. As I already said, how you usually you document and describe the language, and then you go ahead and you describe or you document variation. But what happened when you don't have documentation and description? What do you know? How do you know what it varies actually is not part of the language itself, but actually something else that you can that you don't know how it works. So it's kind of complicated to do so. The another blind spot is a very small population. If you're going to go ahead and go for the variationist approach, you have a very small population, 4 speakers, elders. You don't have a lot of people that you can work with, so your sample gets very small, and actually you cannot make a difference between, I mean, if you use statistics approaches, it's going to be very complicated to actually use them in these cases. What happens if it's a socially homogeneous population, as I'm saying in Ayapaneco? Elders, males, all of them are very homogeneous. I can explain a little bit more what I refer to socially homogeneous in the case of Ayapaneco. But what happens? The underlying principle about the social variables is that the variables exist because also people are socially heterogeneous. So that correlates with the social variable, gender, sex, ethnicity, so on. But what you have a very, very homogeneous population, and you want to check out, and you wanted to check social variables, how do you do that? And what happened when you have a very limited interactions in the language? Something else is actually when you work in variation, usually you need a lot of interaction. Sometimes even the researchers that study variation and variationist approach are speakers of the language themselves, and they actually can study the language and can get a lot of interactions. They can interact themselves, but what happened with those interactions is very limited because the language is critically endangered. Another blind spot is the common social variables used in world societies for this kind of work. Usually you have religion, education, age, gender, class, profession, etc. Those variables that you actually usually in most of social linguistic variation studies exist. Sometimes they don't work very well in these cases, such as critically endangered languages, and I'm gonna explain a little bit more why is that. So this brings us to some fundamental challenges that this case presents. Well, so when I started to work with Ayapaneco, I didn't know how many speakers there were. I thought it was 2 or 3, but soon I started to realize that there were about 15 back in the day when I started to work with them. Unfortunately, a lot of them passed over the years. And so far, right now, we have about approximately 80 speakers. And I happen to be able to work with 4 of them for my PhD dissertation. Right now, I work with the 5th one, not for my PhD dissertation, but in general. So let's say that with 4 out of 8, I cover pretty much 50% of the entire population of the speakerhood, which is a lot if you think about it, but it happens to be a very reduced number. So all of them are very socially homogeneous. By socially homogeneous, I mean that they all men between 72 and 84 years old. They have the same religion, the same profession. They all work in the field. They were agricultural workers. They're born and raised in the same village, Ayapa. Uh, they acquire Ayapaneco's first language. Spanish is the second language. There's no social difference, social classes among them. None of them is rich and the other poor, but they are very similar in terms of the social class. None of them has a religious I don't know, to be a priest or something like that, or a political charge or something like that, that he could be someone important in the village. So they're very, very, very homogeneous in terms of social categories used in for actually making the difference between them. Maybe the biggest difference is probably the age, but even though they all belong to the grandparents generation, none of them is on the other generation of parents. They're all grandparents. So having said that, there's no evident correlation between variables and common social parameters. As I said, if all of these parameters are the same, how you make the difference between one or the other? And that's one of the big challenges when you try to correlate a social variable with a specific person or a specific item in the language. So no evident correlation that these social variables are going to work in this case. And then without a previous description of the language, then you will know, okay, it's kind of complex to identify the rules that govern intralinguistic variation. So if you don't have functionally social categories to actually link to a specific item of language, you will say, okay, I will go to the linguistic and I'm just going to deal with intralinguistic variation. But if you don't have a previous or a writing or a description of the language, how do you know that this actually belongs to the intralinguistic variation or not to another kind of variation? So those are the challenges that that you're going to face if you work in this same context that I'm telling you here, or I'm sharing, and that's something that we need to kind of like pay attention. So having said that, it's possible to identify some patterns of variation in Ayapaneco and other Creek endangered languages. So first of all, of course, there's intralinguistic variation. Of course, the rules. I mean, it's a grammar. You have different morphemes or syntactic structures that actually follow a specific rule, etc. That's something that exists in Ayapaneco. It's something that you cannot say that doesn't exist. So of course that exists. And also there's social linguistic variables too. However, these variables actually are different what you can find in other contexts in weird societies. The first one is common to all of this, the individual variation. That means the way that we speak as an individual that is different from the other ones, and all these variants that we use that probably other person don't use. And that's common to every single language in the world. And Ayapaneco, certain variables, some type of variation actually follows this principle, the individual. And then we have two other social categories that actually are completely different or that could be interesting. One is family. So out of the 4 speakers, we have 2 representative of 2 families. And depending what family you are from, one of the variables are gonna be linked to these families, and you're gonna see it in the language. Actually correlates with the specific items of the language, what family you're coming from. And then you have a sort of partnership. A partnership is something that is like a friendship, but it's not necessarily a friendship. It's just speakers tend to spend time among each other in groups for different reasons, for personal reasons, and that doesn't correlate with family, because the partnerships, the 2 partnerships that I identify don't correlate with family membership. So you could be part of a family member, and that family member will have a correlation with some variables that you use, but sometimes you can be part of another social partnership that doesn't have to do anything with your family, and actually the variables that you're going to produce are gonna be more related to that. So this is the entire social linguistic variables that I found so far. Of course, that doesn't mean that are the only ones operating in this case. But yeah, if you can see, sex, gender, class, or all the classic parameters that we use don't actually have any I didn't find any evidence of them in the study that I did. And then of course comes a third pattern of variation, and this is going to be the part that is gonna, it's when it's gonna get interesting, because so far what I've told you is nothing out of the norm or out of like something that is not something that you haven't heard before if you study social linguistic variation or other kind of literature like that. But then we have something that is unstructured variation, and unstructured variation is a pattern of variation by default because it's not a pattern variation. Let's say that it's a pattern of no pattern variation. And what I mean by unstructured variation. Unstructured variation is this variation that is present in the language practices of more than one speaker, but not linguistically or socially patterned. So this is when it gets interesting, because as I said, the variationist approach tells us that language variation structure in two main dimensions, linguistic and social. But what happened when you find variation and doesn't actually structure in linguistic or social pattern? What do you do with this variation? What is that? And actually, that's what happens in Ayapaneco. And this kind of variation, it's present in the language practices of more than one speaker. If it was one single speaker, you will say that actually it's due to its own individual way to speak the language, and it's kind of an individual kind of variation. But if it's more than one speaker and doesn't correlate with any other social variables that you find, so you don't have an explanation for that variation. And when you cannot infer and you cannot say when that variation is going to appear, makes it a little bit more problematic. To give you an idea, some people would say, well, it's a marginal kind of variation. I bet that this just social linguistic variation and linguistic variation would be the variation that you will find in our regular corpus, and probably unstructured variation is anecdotal. It's something like, okay, maybe it's there and we don't know what it is, but it would be minimum compared to the other. Actually, in my study, that it took like 52 tokens of variation, just tokens of variation, not language in general, but just a specific tokens of variation, just variation, different kind of variation in different levels, syntax, phonological, etc. 24 of them correspond to unstructured variation. That means 48% of the tokens that I have are unstructured. So the question goes back to the same to the beginning of this. When you document a language, you're also document these things that actually you don't know what it is, or you don't know how they correlate, you know how they're structured, and that's contrary to what you think. Actually, in these languages or in this specific kind of languages, can be very, very rampant. It can be represent the majority of the corpus that you have. So we need to have a way to understand what is happening, or to understand, or at least to try to pay attention to it. And some people will say, okay, maybe that's something that happens in Ayapaneco for different reasons, and it's an isolated case. But actually, checking out the literature, there are documented cases in other critical endangered languages around the world that document precisely this kind of variation. Some of them call it unstructured, some of them call it some variation that researchers didn't actually couldn't understand what was happening, but they said this variation that doesn't correlate with anything, and they assume that this kind of variation was due to a linguistic obsolescence because the language is about to disappear. So therefore, something must be happening there, and that creates this variation that we cannot describe. We just can say that exists, but we don't have a way to actually study it, or even to document it, or actually we just document it, but we don't have a way to study it, or actually to give you more answers about what the variation it's coming from. So to kind of make a quick summary of this so far, so we have three main principles of patterns of variation: linguistic variation, that is internal to the language; social linguistic variation, that is related to social factors; and I'm adding a third element to this pattern of variation and structure, and that's something that it's something that I am adding to the structure, to the heterogeneity principle, other heterogeneity principle. And actually, I'm saying that the orderly heterogeneity principle is not so orderly. Actually, it's more heterogeneous than actually you can think, because you have that element of a structure that doesn't allow to structure or to understand variation in any of those two terms. But that exists. It's something that exists, And that's something that is being documented in Ayapaneco, and not only in Ayapaneco, but in other languages in the world. So you can have examples of purely linguistic variation that will go descriptive linguistics and all the people that work in describing a language for a grammar with the rules. Then you have just exclusively social variation. That's for social linguists working in a language that they want to find this specific variable or variant in related to social aspects of the language. So they will do a description and study, and they will work on that. And then we have a third one that is unstructured, that you don't know what it is exactly, but exists, and you cannot deny it when it represents 48% of the corpus that you have. So for sure, it's something's going on there. So you can have very specific cases of each of them. But at the same time, you can have cases in which one single element, and in some cases, some elements of the language overlap, and actually you have an interplay of this covariation. So in a single item, you can have an item that corresponds to a structure, linguistic structure variation, social structure variation, and can be at the same time something that is unstructured variation. And that's a little bit for those that know a little bit about a quantum word. It's kind of like the thing that the quantum object can be 0, 1 at the same time, or can have several states at the same time. And this is exactly what happens in this kind of variation. Variation can have different characteristics. Not necessarily has to be one or the other, but it could be one or the other, and a probability of the other too. So this is kind of interesting to actually understand what is happening. There's an interplay of covariation happening in some cases. This is an example of how it looks like. I'm not going to give the entire explanation of this, but this is an example of how it works. This is one single element. Yuku is something that means on top of. For instance, if you see on top of the mountain, on top of the mountain, for instance, you can use that. It's a preposition or postposition. So this single item can be analyzed as a variable that is social. For instance, the first layer of variance is yuku, yu, and u, which is the same, refers to the same element, but it changes of form depending who says it. And that correlates with individual. That means that certain speakers use one form and only one form, and the other speakers use the other form. And some of these forms actually correlate with family. Certain families, actually yuku is used for 2 members of the same family and the other no, and so forth. So actually you have that yuku correlates in a social manner. And then you go to the second layer of variables. Yuku also correlates with syntax, and that's more linguistic variable, because yuku as a postposition is used most with few nouns. So instead of saying mountain on top, is very with very few nouns actually used like that. But most nouns you use on top of. So it's a preposition now. So you can infer. You have a rule of distribution. Say most nouns use yuku as a preposition. Very few nouns use yuku as a postposition. So it's like that will be a case for language description study actually. But the problem, it doesn't end here, because actually we say, okay, family and linguistic. But then if you see the dotted points there, that means that sometimes certain forms can be used for other speakers, and that not necessarily belongs to the same family or the partnership. And sometimes also some speakers, it could be postposition or preposition depending on the speaker, and doesn't really correlate with either individual speaker, family, or partnership. So yuku, this variable that seems so simple and it's just one localization in the language, can be at the same time structure, linguistically structured, socially structured, and unstructured, all at the same time. So that's what I was saying. If you don't address variation in this case, you will be losing a lot of you will be leaving out from the language and the study or whatever you're doing a great deal of information about the language and the community itself. So if you are a linguist that actually describe the language, you're probably going to go for the distribution rule, the syntax rule that is actually linguistic. If you're a social linguist, probably you're going to work out, okay, that's variable that goes with a family, so I will put it in my description. But you will be leaving out the structure variation too. So this is actually why it's important to understand that there could be several layers of variation, and when you decide for one of them, you're actually leaving out a lot of information out of what you your description or the study that you're doing. So actually, this is one of the main context, or one of the main examples that I always like to share, because it's very clear in terms of everything. I mean, it's kind of complicated, the image, but actually tells you a lot about the complexity. If you're writing a grammar of this, how do you write this grammar? You know, like you will need like something like that to write the grammar. It gets a little bit complicated. So this has some implications, of course. So the implications that this has, specifically talking about unstructured variation, but in variation in general and creating endangered languages, is the degree of language endangerment seems to correlate with the proportion of a structured variation. This means that the most endangered the language is, chances are that you're going to find more unstructured variation. So remember what I told you, that linguists used to think in the 70s that that was linguistic obsolescence. I never like to use linguistic obsolescence because I always thought that that doesn't mean anything. What is linguistic obsolescence in general? It's kind of a complicated term when you don't have a really appropriate text or context about that. Basically, with this, I'm saying that the most endangered languages, the more the high proportion of structure variation what you'll find. So I have an explanation for this, but this is the first implication that this has. When you study variation in a multifactorial analysis, that actually you're not limited either by descriptive linguistic or social linguistic approach. So as I said, common social variables used for weird societies may not always be pertinent, as in the case of Ayapaneco. You need to find other social variables that are pertinent. And sometimes when you start with a social linguistic approach, sometimes you come with this idea that you're going to find the same variables or similar variables, and it in every case could be extremely different from one each other. So the challenge here is to find the social variables that are pertinent for these specific cases. Then, well, the other implication is social homogeneity is not equal to linguistic homogeneity. We used to think that the most heterogeneous our society or a group of people is, that's going to be equals to linguistic heterogeneity as well, which is true. But we thought that social homogeneity was equal to linguistic homogeneity. In the case of Ayapaneco and other critically endangered languages actually show us that is not necessarily the case. So that's another very important implication here. And then finally, this is one of the implications that I love the most, because for years we've been discussing about linguistic universals. For years, linguists have said, okay, this specific construction, for instance, recursivity. Remember the whole debate between Chomsky and other linguists saying if recursivity is a universal of language or not, and then you find language that doesn't seem to have recursivity and so on. And there's the whole debate of finding a linguistic universal. Well, it's been always there in front of our eyes that variation is a universal. So something that we never necessarily think or consider as one of the universals of language, but it is. The proof is that you can find variation from very widely spoken languages like English to a very, very critically endangered languages such as Japaneco. You find variation. So something that is a universal of language deserves a lot of attention. However, for some reason, it hasn't been the case in linguistics. We take it for granted variation, but not necessarily take it like with importance as if it was another universal of language. So that's something that very, very important to actually to say here. So there's a explanation for this. There's a multifactorial explanation for this that I want to go very quickly. So I'm gonna talk about three main explanations out of 6 that I actually found in my work in my PhD. But 3 main explanations for this, why there's such a high proportion of structure variation in this language and what it's causing it. Well, one of them is actually the size of the speakerhood. And that's something very important because it seems that the size of a speakerhood impacts the structure of language. We have found evidence in other contexts that are not in critically endangered languages, but in a controlled environment, a lab, that they have been doing studies in artificial or fake languages. And we find that the reduced size of a speakerhood actually has an impact on the structure of the language. That could be corroborated in this case with Ayapaneco and the critically endangered languages that tend to have very small proportion of speakers. Actually, that would explain why we have a lot of unstructured variation in these languages. Another important explanation is the children in the language. As I said, if Creek and endangered languages are spoken by elders, we don't have children that speak the language. And contrary to what we tend to think, children, I'm not talking about teenagers, but children do not actually generate variables themselves necessarily, but actually they filter, which means that if you have 5 variables among the speech of adults, they're gonna choose 1 or 2 or something like that, and they're gonna spread it to the next generations and so on. At the end of, I don't know, 2-3 generations, out of the 5 variables, probably you're gonna end with 2, and that's gonna be language change. Remember that before language change, there's variation, but at some point that variation goes to the size of language change. One of these 2 variables will succeed and the other will disappear. And that's exactly what is not happening in Ayapaneco. Since there's no children to filter the variables, all the variables remain. So the adults keep producing variables. We're very good as adults to produce variables. If you're just talking with adults, we can produce an incredible amount of variables. But if there's no one to filter out these variables, like in the case of Creek and endangered languages in Ayapaneco, probably you're gonna end up with a lot of variables in this language, and it seems to be the case in Ayapaneco. The last one of the last points of explanation here is that speaking or not speaking with strangers, it seems to have an impact with the language. And when I say speaking with strangers, I don't mean that in general, but in the language, using the language to speak with strangers. In the case of Ayapaneco, since there's like a very small speakerhood, only Ayapaneco members of the community use the language among themselves. They cannot use it as a lingua franca with another community, or there's another community that actually are Ayapaneco speakers that they exchange information and they talk to each other or something like that. It seems that they're not speaking with strangers has an impact with on the language in different aspects of the language. And this could be another explanation why actually we're seeing all of this variation happening at the same time. And as I said, 48% of a corpus of variation, it's quite big to try to have an explanation. So this is just like a snapshot of a multifactorial analysis or explanation what is happening and why you can find this kind of elusive variation, this kind of elusive elements of variation that you don't know what to do with it, but you cannot ignore them. They're just right there. So let's do a first circle here and talk about the quote that I started at the beginning. So when I told you that Manuel Segovia, he was my teacher and a friend, he just passed in 2020. And actually didn't tell the entire story about this phrase because that was the last thing he told me when I saw him. And was in February before the pandemic started in Mexico. And he told me that when we're talking about language endangerment and about different things of language. And he told me that phrase that I remember that I just skip it and said, like, this is a wonderful phrase. I need to understand and I need to think more about it. And as I said, it really summarizes why the language, I mean, how you understand the disappearance of the language, but at the same time, this on a structure variation. So if words are like the wind as on a structure variation, a variation itself, you can feel them, you can see it. 48% of my corpus is this air, this wind that is coming and actually blowing my hair and it's there. And then all of a sudden disappear and you don't know what happened. It's exactly what I'm saying in this conference. I know that it's here. I felt the wind in my face. I can see the wind moving the things. In this case, I see the variation moving the language and moving other things, and I can actually track it. I can document it, but I don't know what happened. And then they could disappear over one generation, or later on, maybe these variables or these variants are going to disappear. So I think that this phrase or this quote that Manuel this thought that Manuel told me, it was very powerful, and I really think that we arrived to the same conclusion by different means. Me as studying the language in a more scientific or academic framework, and he as the experience of the speakers himself. He felt the language was like this, the variation was like this, and actually we converged in the same. Actually, at the end over the last year, thinking about it and thinking a little bit more about it, I felt that we converge into the same actually understanding of language endangerment and into the same understanding of variation as such. So I think that that's why for me it was important to include this thought, Emmanuel, because actually I think it's very, very poetic at the same time that summarizes well what I've been saying for 50 minutes, but when different words, and actually it's so simple at the same time so profound, and at the same so accurate. once that you study and analyze the data, you see that he was right. And the only thing that I want to say that is he was right. When he told me that, I didn't know that that it was gonna be like such a powerful thought. But then after thinking and seeing all the things that the data, the analysis and everything, I agree that what he said, it was exactly, he nailed it in the and how he experienced the language endangerment and variation itself. And now I found that like the evidence that what he told me is exactly what it was. So with that, I think that I just want to conclude and welcome, as we say in Ayapaneco, Dios yoha, which means thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the live stream and also stop